Today marks 100 days since Nancy disappeared, and her daughter stood before cameras on Mother's Day with a plea that should shake anyone paying attention. Someone knows something that could bring Nancy home, and that someone has remained silent for 100 days, while a family suffers through every breath without answers. If you care about cases like this, about holding investigations accountable, about giving voices to victims who cannot speak for themselves, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Vic. This channel exists because of viewers who refuse to let these stories fade into silence. Now let's talk about what has gone wrong in the search for Nancy Guthrie, and why 100 days later, we still don't know where she is. Nancy Guthrie was not a woman who could simply walk away. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, who you may recognize from national television, sat down for an interview where she described her mother's physical condition in terms that leave no room for misunderstanding. Nancy suffered from tremendous back pain. Her mobility was severely limited. On a good day, she could manage the walk from her house to the mailbox. Most days, even that short distance was beyond her capability. This was not a woman who could wander off into the desert. This was not someone who could disappear on her own 2 feet. Yet in the critical hours after her disappearance, that theory somehow took root. The evidence at Nancy's home told a story that should have been impossible to misread. Blood stained the front doorstep. The trail of blood led away from the house, terminating at a location consistent with where a vehicle would pull up. The Ring camera that should have captured whoever approached the property had been yanked off the wall. Doors that should have been closed were standing open. Savannah Guthrie would later describe her reaction to learning these facts. She and her family were insisting that something needed to be done, that this was not okay, that something was very wrong. The physical evidence screamed foul play. Then there was the figure that investigators came to call the porch clown. Surveillance footage, presumably from a nearby camera, captured an individual in tactical gear approaching the property. A retired FBI agent who has reviewed the case described the costume as designed to frighten, calling it overkill, with too many aspects that seemed out of place. The get-up included what this agent referred to as a tactical phallic symbol, whatever that disturbing detail might entail. The image of this figure suggests premeditation, suggests someone who dressed for intimidation, suggests a level of planning that contradicts any theory of random wandering or voluntary departure. So we have an 84-year-old woman with severely limited mobility. We have blood. We have forced entry. We have a ripped-out security camera. We have a person in tactical gear appearing on surveillance. And yet, according to sources close to the investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's detectives initially operated under the theory that Nancy had walked away. One source described how this assumption slowed things down in the critical early hours of the investigation. Those first 24 to 48 hours, the window when evidence is freshest and trails are warmest, were potentially compromised by a fundamental misreading of what had occurred. Sergeant Aaron Cross of the Pima County Sheriff's Office, who also serves as the union president, has been providing updates on the case. Last week, he told reporters that he had received information from detectives indicating that Nancy's family initially thought she may have walked away. This statement immediately raised questions because it directly contradicted what Savannah Guthrie had said publicly. She had been clear that given her mother's condition and the evidence at the scene, wandering off was never a possibility the family entertained. The disconnect was jarring. Over the weekend, Sergeant Cross reached back out with a correction. He explained that he had followed up with the detectives and clarified what they actually meant. The family did not think Nancy had walked away on her own. Instead, they wondered if perhaps she had experienced some kind of medical emergency and called for an ambulance herself. In other words, the family's theory involved Nancy leaving with someone she had summoned for help, not wandering off under her own power. This distinction matters enormously. It means the family, from the very beginning, understood that if their mother left that house, it was either because she needed emergency medical assistance or because she was taken by force. That clarification aligns with what Savannah stated in her interview. She emphasized that her mother was in tremendous pain, that walking was a challenge, that there was no scenario in which wandering off made sense. She pointed to the blood on the doorstep and the yanked camera, saying her family was telling authorities that something needed to be done, that this was not a case of an elderly woman simply getting confused and walking away. But here is where the picture becomes murkier. Despite the correction from Sergeant Cross about what the family believed, sources close to the investigation have confirmed that the detectives themselves were indeed operating under a walk-away theory in those initial hours. An anonymous source, speaking with altered voice and obscured identity to protect their position, stated that this assumption about Nancy walking away slowed the investigation's response. Whether the detectives misunderstood what the family was saying, or whether there was some other communication breakdown, the result was the same. Precious time was lost. In missing persons cases, particularly those involving elderly individuals, walk-away scenarios are common enough that investigators have to consider them. A retired lieutenant from the Arizona Department of Public Safety acknowledged this reality, noting the high number of cases that do involve an actual walk-away. The problem is that once investigators lock into that theory, confirmation bias can set in. Evidence that contradicts the theory might be minimized. Avenues of investigation that assume foul play might be delayed. And in a case where every hour matters, where a trail grows colder with each passing minute, those delays can mean the difference between recovery and permanent disappearance. By the time the walkaway theory was definitively ruled out, questions were already swirling about whether the investigation had stumbled out of the gate. The blood, the forced entry, the tactical figure on surveillance, all of it should have pointed toward abduction from the start. Why it did not, why there was confusion about what the family believed versus what investigators assumed, remains one of the frustrating unanswered questions 100 days into Nancy's disappearance. But the confusion over the initial response is only part of a larger story about how this investigation has been handled. A deeper issue has emerged, one that involves jurisdictional control, institutional ego, and the question of whether the right resources have been deployed to find Nancy Guthrie. That issue centers on the relationship between the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sheriff Chris Nanos runs the Pima County Sheriff's Office. He is the elected official ultimately responsible for this investigation, and according to multiple sources, he has a history with the FBI that is anything but friendly. Footage from 2016 reportedly shows Sheriff Nanos expressing strong negative sentiments about the federal agency. This is not speculation or rumor. People familiar with the situation have pointed to specific instances where the sheriff has made his feelings about the FBI known. That history becomes critically important when you consider what happened after Nancy disappeared. The FBI offered resources to assist in the search for Nancy Guthrie. According to Kash Patel, a former federal official, the Bureau had hundreds of agents ready to deploy to Tucson, hundreds of trained investigators, analysts and specialists who could have been brought to bear on this case. The manpower, the technology, the experience in handling complex abduction cases, all of it was available. The Pima County Sheriff's Office did not take full advantage of that offer. To be clear, the FBI was not entirely shut out. They were involved in a support capacity. They worked on the Mexico angle, reaching out to the legal attaché office in Mexico and reviewing camera footage at border crossings. But operational control remained with the local sheriff's department. The FBI did not take over the investigation. They did not flood the zone with hundreds of agents. They assisted, but they did not lead. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the same union president who had been providing updates, recently made a statement that represents a significant shift. He said that, in his opinion, the sheriff should have given the investigation over to the FBI. This is remarkable for several reasons. Cross works for the sheriff's office. He represents the deputies and officers who work these cases. For him to publicly state that their department should have handed control to the feds is a break with institutional loyalty. He cited the resource disparity as his reason. The sheriff's office simply does not have hundreds of agents at its disposal. They do not have the same breadth of capabilities. When someone offers you an army, Cross suggested, why would you turn it down? The implication is clear. Pride, ego, or past animosity may have influenced the decision to maintain local control. And if that is true, if jurisdictional territorialism played any role in limiting the resources applied to finding an 84-year-old woman, then we have a problem that extends beyond investigative missteps into the realm of institutional failure. A retired lieutenant from the Arizona Department of Public Safety offered his perspective on another dimension of the FBI question. He pointed out that if Mexico was suspected as a destination for Nancy or her abductors, that would make this a federal investigation. Crossing international borders triggers federal jurisdiction. So, the lieutenant theorized, if there was a great deal of effort to keep the feds out of this case, the best way to do that would be to deny any possibility of international transport. In other words, by downplaying the Mexico angle, the sheriff's office could maintain control. Mexico is not some distant hypothetical. The border is 45 minutes from Nancy's home in Tucson. There are 3 primary crossing points in the area. The main one, Nogales, is a fortified port of entry with substantial infrastructure. Investigators on this case have personally visited the border to understand the logistics. Walking into Mexico through Nogales requires passing through a security door, but there is no one asking questions. There is no passport check. You simply walk through, and you are in another country. Driving across is similarly straightforward. Most of the time, vehicles pass into Mexico with minimal or no inspection. Coming back into the United States is an entirely different experience. It is like going through airport security. There are questions, document checks, scrutiny. But heading south into Mexico, the path is wide open. If someone had Nancy in a vehicle, either alive or deceased, getting her across that border would not have required elaborate planning or special access. It would have required a 45-minute drive and the willingness to cross. All 3 of the primary crossing points near Nancy's home have cameras. These are federal systems monitored by federal agents. When Nancy disappeared, the FBI began reviewing that footage. They were looking at the timestamps, trying to identify vehicles that could have made the crossing in the hours and days after she vanished. The problem is that without a description of a suspect vehicle, the task is enormous. Thousands of cars cross those checkpoints every few hours. Reviewing all of that footage, trying to spot something suspicious without knowing what you are looking for, is like searching for a needle in a haystack. There is also the possibility of crossing outside the official checkpoints. The desert itself is porous. Migrants cross on foot, avoiding official channels. People who know the area, who understand the terrain, can move between countries without passing through a camera-monitored gate. However, for this case, that scenario seems less likely. Nancy's age and physical condition would have made a desert crossing on foot nearly impossible unless she was already incapacitated or dead. Carrying or transporting a body through rough terrain is not impossible, but it adds layers of difficulty and risk. The retired FBI agent consulted on this case noted that even if suspects did not immediately drive to Mexico, they might have had a cooling-off period. They could have held Nancy somewhere nearby for hours or even days before attempting a border crossing. This would allow the initial panic to subside, let investigators focus their attention elsewhere, and then make the move when scrutiny had lessened. Looking at border camera footage over an extended window, accounting for the possibility of delayed transport, turns an already massive task into something even more daunting. So why did the sheriff's office so quickly dismiss the Mexico angle publicly? Within roughly 2 weeks of Nancy's disappearance, statements were made indicating that investigators did not believe Mexico was involved. But how could they know that with such certainty? Without a suspect, without a vehicle description, without knowing who took Nancy or where they might have gone, ruling out a border crossing 45 minutes away seems premature at best. The retired lieutenant's theory offers one possible answer. If the goal was to keep the FBI from taking control, then downplaying international transport would be essential. The moment the case credibly involves crossing into Mexico federal jurisdiction becomes much harder to contest. The FBI's role shifts from optional support to justifiable lead agency. If Sheriff Nanos wanted to maintain control, if his history with the FBI made him resistant to ceding authority, then minimizing the Mexico possibility would serve that strategic interest. This is not to say definitively that such a calculation occurred. We do not have internal emails or recorded conversations proving that the Mexico angle was suppressed for jurisdictional reasons, but the timeline, the quick dismissal, the sheriff's known antipathy toward the FBI, and the resource disparity all create a picture that raises serious questions. And those questions matter because if the border should have been a primary focus from day one, if agents should have been flooding the ports of entry and the desert routes, if international cooperation should have been mobilized immediately, then any delay has consequences that cannot be undone. 100 days later, where does the investigation stand? That depends on who you ask. Sheriff Nanos was recently approached outside his office by a reporter who shouted questions at him as he headed to his vehicle. The reporter asked if they were any closer to solving the case. The sheriff responded that they were. He then got into his Corvette and drove away. It was a brief exchange, not exactly a detailed briefing, but the message was clear. The official position is that progress is being made. Sources close to the investigation tell a different story. They indicate that the department is not much closer to a resolution than they were weeks ago. This does not mean investigators are sitting idle. Tips continue to come in daily. Thousands of tips poured in during the initial weeks, and more arrive regularly. Each one has to be tracked down, evaluated, and either pursued or ruled out. That work is ongoing and intensive. DNA evidence is being processed. Leads are being followed. But in terms of having a specific suspect, a concrete theory of the crime, or a clear path to closure, the sources suggest that breakthrough has not arrived. The case is not cold. It remains active, but there is a difference between active and advancing. A case can have daily activity, constant work, dedicated investigators, and still not be moving closer to an arrest. The truth is that some cases hit walls. Evidence runs out. Witnesses do not come forward. The crucial piece of information that would crack everything open remains hidden. Whether that is what has happened here, or whether new evidence is still being developed behind the scenes, is something only those inside the investigation can truly know. What is not in question is the anguish of Nancy's family. Savannah Guthrie posted a video on Mother's Day, 100 days after her mother disappeared. It featured photos and videos of Nancy, memories of a woman who is a mother, daughter, sister, and grandmother. The text accompanying the video was a raw expression of grief and determination. Savannah wrote that they miss Nancy with every breath, that they will never stop looking, that they will never be at peace until she is found. She made a direct plea to the public. Someone knows something that can make the difference, that someone might be watching this video right now. There is a reward available for information leading to Nancy's recovery. Tips can be called into the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. The tips can be anonymous. No one is asking for your name if you are afraid to come forward. But if you know something, if you saw something, if you heard something that could matter, the family is begging you to speak up. Tomorrow, the Pima County Board of Supervisors will hold a meeting. One of the items on their agenda is whether to take action regarding Sheriff Nanos. The nature of that action, whether it involves censure, a call for resignation, or an attempted removal, will become clear when the meeting unfolds. But the fact that it is happening at all speaks to the level of concern about how this investigation has been managed. When a union president breaks ranks to say the case should have been handed to the feds, when families are pleading for answers 100 days in, when sources inside the investigation contradict the sheriff's public optimism, the pressure builds. This is not a case that is going to fade quietly. Nancy Guthrie's family will not allow it. Journalists will not stop asking questions. The public will not forget the image of an 84-year-old woman with chronic pain unable to walk, vanishing from her home, while blood marked the doorstep and a figure in tactical gear haunted the surveillance footage. The answers are out there. Someone knows where Nancy is. Someone knows who took her. Someone knows why. 100 days is a long time to stay silent. It is a long time to carry that weight. It is a long time to live with information that could end a family's suffering. If that person is listening, understand this. Every day that passes makes it harder. Every day compounds the tragedy. But it is not too late to do the right thing. It is not too late to make the call. If this case matters to you, if you believe accountability and pressure make a difference, I need you to support this channel. Hit that like button. Subscribe to True Crime Vic. Share this video with someone who cares about justice. This story continues, and you will hear every development as it happens. Nancy Guthrie deserves answers. Her family deserves peace, and 100 days of silence is 100 days too long. The decision to keep the FBI at arm's length has consequences that extend far beyond jurisdictional pride. When you have hundreds of federal agents sitting in hotel rooms, ready to deploy, ready to bring resources and expertise that a local department simply cannot match, and those agents are not utilized, you have to ask what was lost in that decision. The retired FBI agent consulted on this case did not mince words about what should have happened versus what actually occurred, and her assessment of the first week of this investigation should concern anyone who cares about whether Nancy Guthrie will ever be found. According to Sergeant Aaron Cross, the first week of the Nancy Guthrie investigation was not just disorganized, it was chaotic. He described it as such a mess that detectives were not even able to communicate effectively with each other. This was not a case of intentionally withholding information from the FBI. It was, by his account, a fundamental breakdown in coordination. And if local investigators could not communicate among themselves, the prospect of effective collaboration with federal agents becomes even more remote. One incident captures just how dysfunctional things became. A neighbor in Nancy's area reported that FBI agents showed up at her sister's home during that first week. The sister was not convinced these individuals were actually federal agents. She thought they might be imposters. The Pima County Sheriff's Office then launched an investigation into whether these FBI agents were fake. They took fingerprints. They were there all night. And in the end, it turned out the agents were real. They were legitimate FBI personnel doing their jobs. But the fact that local law enforcement was investigating whether federal agents were imposters rather than coordinating with them tells you everything you need to know about the level of dysfunction. The retired FBI agent explained that even if there was confusion about where agents were supposed to be searching, that kind of breakdown should not happen when proper systems are in place. She referenced something called Incident Command System, or ICS. This is a standardized approach to managing emergency response operations. It is used by law enforcement, fire departments, and emergency management agencies across the country. The protocols are taught, practiced, and drilled constantly. When multiple agencies respond to a scene, everyone knows their role. There are established procedures for how information flows into the command post and how it is disseminated to the respective parties. In a properly functioning ICS structure, you would have the Pima County Sheriff's Office, local police departments, the FBI, Border Patrol, and any other relevant agencies all working from the same command post. Everyone wears identifying vests. Everyone knows how to communicate. The physical setup is standardized. You have tables arranged in a specific way, communications equipment in place, and clear chains of command. The retired agent emphasized that this is not theoretical. These systems have been refined over decades. Agencies practice them regularly. There is no excuse for the kind of chaos that Sergeant Cross described. She pointed out that when the FBI deploys to a scene, they do not show up empty-handed. They bring everything needed to establish a command post in the middle of nowhere if necessary. Trucks arrive with computers, communications equipment, and specialists who know how to set up operations rapidly. She compared it to combat engineers in the military who can build a landing strip in the jungle in 10 hours. When the FBI sets up, It happens fast, and it happens efficiently. Antennas go up, cables get laid, systems come online, and within a short time, you go from an empty field to a fully operational command center. If the sheriff had handed control to the FBI, or even allowed them to take a more active operational role, that infrastructure would have been in place. The chaos that defined the first week could have been avoided. Specialists in evidence collection, digital forensics, surveillance analysis, and a dozen other disciplines would have been deployed immediately. Instead, according to sources, those hundreds of agents sat in hotels, unable to fully engage. As the retired agent put it, they were there to work, ready to help the investigation. But they were not put to work, and the cost of that decision may be measured in evidence that was never collected or was compromised during the chaotic early response. One detail that has haunted observers of this case is the doormat. Blood was found on Nancy's front doorstep. That blood is critical evidence. It could contain DNA that identifies who was at that house. It could reveal how much blood was shed, which speaks to the severity of violence. It could hold trace evidence, like fibers or particulates that connect to a suspect or a vehicle. And yet, after the initial investigation, that doormat was reportedly still sitting there. The retired FBI agent made clear what she would have done. She would have taken the mat. She would have brought a sawzall, a reciprocating saw used to cut through just about anything, and she would have taken the front door, the door handles, the tiles, whatever was necessary to preserve every bit of potential evidence. She compared evidence collection in serious cases to the way firefighters operate. Firefighters are sometimes jokingly called evidence destroyers because they have to break windows, chop through walls, and tear things apart to fight fires and save lives. But when it comes to critical evidence in a major case, investigators adopt that same aggressive mentality. You do what it takes. You cut out sections of flooring. You remove entire doors. You take everything that might matter. In the case of Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mob boss who was found in Santa Monica after years on the run, the FBI evidence response team went into his apartment and tore it apart. Walls came down. Floors were pulled up. The attitude was that nothing would be left to chance. If there was any possibility that a piece of evidence was hiding in that space, it was coming out. The retired agent suggested that the same approach should have been taken with Nancy Guthrie's home, and if it was not done properly the first time, it should be done now. Her specific recommendation was that Kash Patel, the current FBI director, should ask the Guthrie family for permission to send in the Bureau's evidence response team, known as ERT, to redo the entire house from front to back. Every room, every outbuilding, the garage, the yard, everything. She suggested framing it as a training exercise, bringing in the best ERT teams from around the country and letting them demonstrate what a thorough evidence collection operation looks like. Her confidence was absolute. She believes they would find evidence that others missed. The FBI did eventually get access to Nancy's home. On day 5 of the investigation, agents were seen going in, but according to the retired agent, that was a truncated effort, a couple of hours at most. What she is talking about is a full-scale operation with 15 to 30 agents spending days, if necessary, going over every inch of the property. That is the kind of thoroughness that a case like this demands. And the fact that it has not happened, that the doormat with blood on it was left in place, that the evidence collection appears to have been limited, points to yet another consequence of keeping the FBI in a support role rather than giving them operational control. There is also the question of what evidence actually exists. Reports have circulated that investigators have very little physical evidence to work with. One claim is that they have a single hair without a root. If true, that is a staggeringly small amount of evidence from a crime scene that involved blood, forced entry, and an abduction. The retired FBI agent said she does not believe that can be all they have. She has faith in the local CSI team and the detectives on the ground. But if that report is accurate, if one rootless hair is the sum total of physical evidence, then something went profoundly wrong. Even a hair without a root is not useless. It can still yield mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line. Mitochondrial DNA is not as definitive as nuclear DNA, but it can still narrow down possibilities and potentially link a suspect to the scene. So there is value in that evidence. But for a crime scene with blood evidence, a missing elderly woman, signs of violence, and a figure in tactical gear on surveillance, you would expect far more. You would expect DNA from the blood. You would expect fingerprints from the door, or the ripped-out ring camera. You would expect trace evidence from the point where the blood trail ended. If all of that is absent, the question is why. The retired agent pointed to leadership. If the first week was chaotic, as Sergeant Cross described, that is a leadership problem. Trained professionals do not descend into chaos unless there is confusion at the top. If detectives are getting mixed messages, if there is internal conflict about whether to work with the FBI or keep them at a distance, if there is pressure to handle things a certain way for political reasons, that filters down. It creates uncertainty. It disrupts focus. And in a case where every hour matters, that kind of disruption can be catastrophic. She described what proper leadership looks like in a high-pressure case. You bring your team together. You give them a clear mission. You tell them this is important, that you have confidence in them, and that they need to bring their best. You remove obstacles. You provide resources. You create an environment where people can do their jobs without interference or distraction. If that did not happen in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, if the environment was chaotic and communication was breaking down, that is a failure at the top. And that brings us back to Kash Patel. The current FBI director gave an interview on Sean Hannity's podcast where he spoke about the Nancy Guthrie case in terms that are almost unprecedented. Directors of the FBI do not typically criticize local law enforcement publicly. The Bureau works with thousands of local agencies across the country. Maintaining those relationships requires diplomacy. Even when there are disagreements, even when jurisdiction is contested, the public posture is usually one of cooperation and mutual respect. You build bridges. You work through problems quietly. You do not go on a podcast and air grievances. But Kash Patel did exactly that. He confirmed that the FBI had hundreds of agents ready to go, and he made clear that those agents were not utilized the way they should have been. The retired FBI agent found this extraordinary. She went back through her memory of major cases and jurisdictional conflicts, including Waco and other high-profile incidents where federal and local agencies clashed. Even in those situations, even when things went badly wrong, FBI directors did not publicly criticize other agencies the way Patel has done here. She sees two possible explanations. One is that the case is in even worse shape than anyone outside the investigation realizes, and Patel is trying to get ahead of the fallout. If this case never gets solved, if Nancy Guthrie is never found, the FBI director wants it on the record that his agency offered resources and was rebuffed. That way, when questions are asked about why the case failed, he can point to the fact that hundreds of agents were available and not used. The second possibility is that what happened during that first week was so egregious, so far outside the norms of professional law enforcement, that Patel feels compelled to speak out despite the usual protocols. Either scenario is damning. The retired agent was clear about what she thinks should happen next. Beyond reprocessing the house, beyond bringing in ERT teams, there needs to be an honest accounting of what went wrong and why. If the issue was ego, if Sheriff Nanos allowed his personal feelings about the FBI to interfere with the investigation, that is unacceptable. She put it bluntly. Even if you hate the FBI, so what? The job is to take care of constituents, to do everything possible for people when they are missing, especially vulnerable individuals who are members of the community. You leave your egos at the door, and you get the job done. You never know what could have been accomplished in those first 4 days if the full weight of federal resources had been applied. She pointed out the absurdity of having hundreds of agents and analysts sitting in hotel rooms while a family desperately searches for answers. Those agents were not on vacation. They were there to work. They were being paid with taxpayer money to help find Nancy Guthrie. Instead, they were sidelined. That is not just a waste of resources. It is a betrayal of the purpose of law enforcement, which is to serve and protect. Leadership means being willing to give up territory when it serves the greater good. It means being willing to negotiate, to collaborate, to let others take pieces of the investigation if they have the expertise. The FBI does not come in and take over everything. They offer specific capabilities. Maybe they handle digital forensics, pulling data from phones and computers. Maybe they analyze financial records. If there is a ransom or a motive involving money, maybe they deploy specialized surveillance teams. The point is that they bring tools and skills that complement what local agencies do. The information they develop gets funneled back to the local department in the form of detailed reports. Everyone benefits, but if you refuse to let them in, if you insist on maintaining control, even when you lack the resources to do the job thoroughly, then you are putting pride above justice. And in a case involving an 84-year-old woman who was likely abducted from her home, who may have been injured or killed, that is an unforgivable failure. Tomorrow, the Pima County Board of Supervisors will meet to discuss Sheriff Chris Nanos. Several commissioners have raised the possibility of removing him from office. That is not a simple matter. Nanos is an elected sheriff. Removing an elected official requires meeting specific legal standards. In this case, the focus appears to be on a provision in the state constitution related to the timeliness of his responses to the board. The sheriff was required to submit answers to questions about his work history, specifically allegations that he lied about suspensions from his previous job with the El Paso Police Department. The claim is that his responses were not timely, and that failure could provide grounds for removal. Whether the board will actually move forward with removal proceedings remains to be seen. These are politically charged decisions. Removing a sheriff is a drastic step, but the fact that it is even being discussed, the fact that multiple commissioners are publicly questioning his leadership, shows how much trust has eroded, and the Nancy Guthrie case sits at the center of that erosion. The questions about the first week, about the decision to limit FBI involvement, about the evidence collection, about the chaos and miscommunication, all of it reflects on Nanos and his leadership. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the union president representing the deputies and officers who work under Nanos, has now publicly stated that the investigation should have been handed over to the FBI. That is a remarkable break. Cross is not some outside critic. He is part of the organization. For him to say that his own department should have ceded control is a signal that the problems run deep. It suggests that people inside the sheriff's office recognized that this case was mishandled and that pride or politics got in the way of doing what was best for Nancy Guthrie and her family. 100 days have passed since Nancy disappeared. 100 days of her family living with the agony of not knowing. 100 days of wondering if the investigation could have been different, if resources had been deployed differently, if decisions had been made with Nancy's best interests at the forefront instead of institutional concerns. Savannah Guthrie posted that video on Mother's Day. Images of her mother, a woman who gave life and love, now missing and possibly gone forever. The message was direct. Someone knows something. Someone out there holds information that could make the difference between this case being solved and Nancy being lost forever. If you know something, if you saw something unusual in the days around Nancy's disappearance, if you heard someone talking about it, if you have even the smallest piece of information that might seem insignificant to you but could matter to investigators, you have a responsibility to come forward. The number is 1-800-CALL FBI. Your call can be anonymous. You do not have to give your name. There is a reward available. But more importantly, you have the chance to give a family answers, to give Nancy justice, to potentially help solve a case that has been hampered from the start by failures that never should have happened. The investigation continues. Tips are still coming in. Evidence is still being processed. But the shadow of that first week, the chaos, the missed opportunities, the agents who were ready to help, but were kept on the sidelines, hangs over everything. We do not know what evidence might have been collected if the FBI had been given full access from day one. We do not know what leads might have been developed if hundreds of agents had been knocking on doors, reviewing footage, and conducting interviews. We do not know if Nancy could have been found in those critical early hours if the response had been swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. What we do know is that an 84-year-old woman is missing. We know her family is suffering. We know there was blood at her home, a ripped-out camera, and a figure in tactical gear. We know the case has been marked by confusion and jurisdictional conflict. We know the FBI director has taken the unusual step of publicly calling out the handling of the investigation. And we know that 100 days later, there are still more questions than answers. The Board of Supervisors will meet. They will decide whether Sheriff Nanos stays in his position or faces removal proceedings. That decision will have implications for this case, and for every case the Pima County Sheriff's Office handles going forward. But regardless of what happens politically, the work of finding Nancy Guthrie has to continue. The tips have to be followed. The evidence has to be analyzed. And if it takes bringing in the FBI's evidence response team to go through that house one more time, to find what may have been missed, then that is what should happen. Nancy Guthrie deserves nothing less than a full, competent, and relentless effort to bring her home. Her family deserves to know what happened, and the community deserves to know that when someone vulnerable goes missing, the response will be professional, coordinated, and driven by the mission of finding the truth, not by ego or politics. If this case matters to you, if you believe in accountability and in keeping pressure on investigations that cannot be allowed to fade, then subscribe to True Crime Vic right now. Hit that like button. Share this video. Make sure people know Nancy's name and know what has happened here. This is not over. The investigation continues, and every piece of attention, every share, every person who refuses to let this story go quiet makes a difference. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 100 days. Let's make sure day 101 brings us closer to the truth.